Thank you. Good to see you all here this afternoon. Thank you, really. Day 3 of the festival, and I hope you're all having a really, really good time. I certainly am, and I just, welcome you all here today. I welcome you to the North American premiere of Paul Greengrass's 22nd July. And to begin with, we would like to acknowledge that this afternoon's event is taking place on the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of New Credit and the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe and the Huron-Wendat. We're grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community. Thank you. Now, this film is eligible for the Welsh People's Choice Award. Please vote for your favorite films at tiff.net/vote, and you know how important this award is, so yeah, please do vote. We'd like to thank Netflix, Inc. for providing us with this film this afternoon. Now, thank you. Now, Paul Greengrass, apart from the 3 films in the Bourne series, has made a number of very fine movies based on real events, which are very violent, confrontational real events, and dramatized them with incredible power and sensitivity. In Sunny Bloody Sunday, he dealt with the 1972 Bogside Massacre, also known as Bloody Sunday, and the events of 9/11, which he made into an incredible film called United 93. And the hijacking of the U.S. container ship was turned into a film called Captain Phillips. Now, in 22nd July, he turns his camera on the horrific 2011 attack carried out by one man against a youth camp and the government of Norway. Now, the film is absolutely chilling, as you might well imagine, but it also focuses on the aftermath of the grisly attacks more than it actually does on the events of the 22nd of July. And this is where I found the film riveting, as he looks into the minds of the killer and shows a family dealing with the tragedy and follows a defense lawyer who's actually selected for the case. Now, Paul is one of those filmmakers who's really adept at both action sequences as well as the sensitivity required for very intimate human moments, and 22nd of July certainly has both. Please join me in welcoming the director of this afternoon's film, Paul Greengrass.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for coming out. And thank you, Piers, for welcoming us to the Toronto Film Festival. It's a great honour for all of us involved in this film. I don't want to talk too much because we should get on with the movie. I would just like to say that we live, I think we'd all agree, in pretty unprecedented times. Tomorrow, Sweden goes to the polls with a far-right neo-Nazi party ahead in the polls. Wherever you look across the West, there is an unprecedented shift in our politics towards the right, and not just the right, the hard right, the populist right, the nativist right. And it's unprecedented and troubling, and I wanted to make a film about it. And I was very lucky to be given the permission to make this film by the survivors of these attacks, and to be able to join with Norway's fantastic creative community. They're wonderful actors and technicians. And the film will always be in our minds with those who survived and those who died. So thank you very much for having us.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the stage director Paul Greengrass, actor Jonas Strand Gravli, actor Seide Witt, producer Greg Goodman, author Asna Sierstadt, and editor William Goldenberg. All right. I'd like to start us off just by asking you, Paul. You know, the events of July 2011 were not that long ago. The wounds are still raw, and yet it feels like the world has changed so much that the ideology that drove Breivik to do what he did, it feels like it's only burgeoned in the world in acts of violence. I just wonder, for you, what made this the right time to tell this story in this format?
Well, I think the answer is because exactly what you said, the world's changing fast. I remember when, after I'd read Usna's book, I went and read Breivik's testimony in court. And it was chilling. What was bizarre about it was that those opinions would have been considered, I think, outre in 2011, but that analysis, that worldview, that way of expressing yourself, that's mainstream now. That's mainstream in the United States, all across Europe, the UK, Northern Europe, Eastern Europe, wherever you look. That is the worldview that has conventional centrist politics, whether of centre-left or centre-right, completely on the run. It's been routed by it. Now, of course there is a difference between words and actions. I'm not equating the populist politicians of the right with Anders Breivik, except for this, that where the rhetoric starts and the actions begin is a grey area. And if you start with that worldview, you incubate within it dark and dangerous forces. And speaking for me, I think that my parents and grandparents lived through the 1930s. They saw what uncontrolled nationalism did to the world, and they lived through the war and the conflict and the death and destruction that followed. And I think their generation determined after the Second World War to build a world where the institutions, both within democracies and across democracies, were there to constrain nationalism. And it's that fabric, those guide ropes that anchor down democracies so that they're not challenged by extreme nationalism. They are under attack as I have never seen in my lifetime. And if we don't wake up and find a way of combating these forces, first of all on the level of ideas, then we are going to be in a really parlous state in 10 years' time. That's just my view.
I would also just like to ask regarding your source material regarding Asne's book, which, by the way, if this film, if you respond to this film at all, I could not recommend One of Us, Asne's book, enough. It was source material, and it's a tremendous work of both investigative journalism and storytelling. But I just wonder, there's so much in that text to work from. How did you, find your way through it and find your story?
Well, it is a wonderful book, and by far and away the best book, and a profound, as you say, work of analysis and narrative storytelling. I think what I was interested in was what happened afterwards and the ways in which a democracy fights for itself, because it does seem to me like the story of how Norway responded is an inspiration in the struggle that's underway now, particularly that young people will have to fight. So it was something that Usta and I talked about, but obviously her book is compendious, but she should maybe talk.
Yeah. Could you speak to that at all, about what you see on screen here and how it relates to what you're trying to get across in the book?
Thank you. I think the film complements the book, and it's interesting, just as Paul says, that it's been a few years now and the world has changed. This happened in 2011, and for me as a journalist, it was important to try to find out what happens. As a journalist, I believe in facts, and more than ever, facts are under attack. But I think there is, in our profession, in journalism, that is our duty to actually find out what happened, because when we don't know what happened, when facts are and stories lie in the darkness, that's where rumors thrive, that's where conspiracy theories thrive, that's where people can find and invent their own facts. So of course, this is a big book, it's 500 pages. A film has to be more focused and has to make more stricter decisions what stories to tell. In the book, it's also a lot about what made the terrorist. How come a boy growing up on the nice side of Oslo, rich side of Oslo, how could he attack his own country? What made him? What's the making of a terrorist? So that is, of course, several factors of that right-wing radicalization. We hear a lot more today about the jihadi radicalization, but the factors are very similar. So it's all about that. And then, of course, I also wanted to try to find out what made the political activists on Utøya, like these two guys, the one they're portraying. Why do some people choose peaceful activism and some people choose violence? And of course, as Paul also explores in the film, how do we as a society, how do we respond to that? And then finally, the title of the book is not the date, 22nd of July, which it could have been, but it's called One of Us, which is also important. Breivik, he grew up among us, he actually lived on my street. And he did not grow up in a vacuum. So does he have anything to do with us? Did we make him? Are we to blame too? And also, finally, he's not a monster. He's a human being. And that's important, because once we say he's sick, he's crazy, he's a monster, he's suddenly not to do with us. But he is, we have to deal with him as a human being, because evil is also in humans.
Well, I'm sure some of you must have some questions. If you could just raise your hand and ask, and then I'll repeat so everyone can hear. Yeah, right there. A big question, basically talking about like the increasing xenophobia of the current age and how you think it may affect the generation that's coming of age now.
Well, I certainly think it'll be that generation that's going to have to find the answers. I mean, I think that, this situation is a response to globalization, isn't it? Globalization has given us, this huge crash of 2008 and, flatlining incomes and job insecurity and all of that whole package. At the same time as, particularly in Europe, but worldwide, we're experiencing unprecedented population movements, historically unprecedented, and the fear of them, because the two aren't quite the same. And, of course, the forces of globalization, which are sort of protean and overpowering, want this borderless world, and the problem is it's struggling to have consent, and somewhere there's going to have to be the younger generation are going to have to find a solution to that and find new ways of having open societies, accommodating population movements, because in the end, you can't stop it. It's born of global inequity, ultimately, and how that equates with free societies is going to, that's going to be for your generation to find, and you're right, overcome fear. But I think it's a big problem for sure.
Another question? Yeah, standing up there in the back. So just to really quickly summarize, the question just has to do with the character of the lawyer and whether or not you all have a relationship with him. Or.
You can answer. Yes, we did meet him. He's an extraordinary man. I mean, in many ways, he embodies an entire legal system, because I think the entire Norwegian legal system was challenged, of course. The problem was how to deliver a process that was fair, a due process, but which defeated Breivik. That was the problem. And in the end, he was strong for a long, long time through that trial, but in the end, it was the testimonies of those young people who've been on Utøya, I think, that tipped the balance, and the wisdom of all the lawyers and the judges who came, I think, to the right verdict, which was that he was a political actor, he was not psychotic, and so although tested grievously, I think it came through, and that's an important lesson, how our institutions and our commitment to rule of law holds up under the attack of populism and this huge unprecedented lurch to the political right. That's a challenge, and it's going to be a challenge in all the countries of the West, I think.
Well, of course, I met with everyone that's portrayed in the book and then later in the film. Several meetings, very important to ask Mr. Lippestad his view on being the defender of such a man and their interaction. And of course, as a journalist, I also wanted to meet Breivik. I had to think long about that. Is that someone I need? And I realized, of course, as a journalist, we need to speak to anyone. And the lawyer then, Lippestad, told me, well, write him a letter, because he didn't want to be in go-between me and Breivik. And then we started exchanging letters, Breivik from prison and me in my house. That was interesting, just as you saw in this film, what a manipulative human being he is and how he always tries to negotiate. So when I asked for an interview, he told me, yes, he could grant me an interview if he could edit the book. And then I answered, no, that's not possible. And then he said, well, if he could write the beginning and the end, and I could write the middle, would that be all right? Then he can grant me an interview. So it's like this carried on until, in the end, I have many letters, many pages of letters, but I finally did not meet him.
I think we have time for one more question. I haven't looked up here. Is there yeah, up there in the corner. So the question has to do with Breivik's sentence and whether or not it's likely he could actually be found to not be a threat to society at some point in time.
Well, it's in Norway, the longest sentence you can get is 21 years. But if you are a danger to society, just as it says in the film, every 5 years there will be a hearing that will assess whether you are still a threat. And that will, of course, be psychiatrists and how he still now, for instance, in prisons, he has founded his own party. It's the neo-fascist party of Norway. He's still the only member. He tries to... He's in solitary confinement, so he's not allowed to meet any other inmates. But it's like, it would be things like that. And I think this man will never get out, because he will always be dangerous, also for the reason that he's so manipulative. Even though he would say, I now suddenly believe in multiculturalism and so on, I don't think he's to be trusted, but that's not going to be my decision.
Before we wrap up, I would really like to take an opportunity to ask the actors we have here about your experience on this film, working through so much pain and trauma, but also recovery. I just wonder if you could say something about how this experience was for you, working with Paul on this film.
Yeah, I can start. Well, of course it was hard to work on this film, but I felt really safe working with Paul. He's done such great films before, so I knew that he was going to make a good film when I heard about it. And yeah, I think as an actor you have to have a whole different approach to a role like this than anything else, because I just wanted to tell the story of Viljar in a respectful and honorable way, and yeah, that was the important part.
No, please.
No, that was the most important part for us, to tell the stories of the victims in the most respectful way as we could. And we both spoke with the people that we were portraying, and they were so lovely during this whole process. And they told us just we're telling their stories, but in our way. And with working with Paul, we knew that we were completely safe in telling this story about Norway and about the world and right-wing extremism in the most respectful way.
And lastly, I'm also just thinking about the fact that, you know, in Cameron Bailey's program note for the film, he described this as an ethical procedural, which I thought was a really interesting way to think of the film. And so I was wondering, William, if you could actually speak about how trying to cut together a film like this, how the questions of ethics and, you know, marry storytelling, and if there's something you can say about that.
Well, I mean, certainly not being a Norwegian, I read as much as I could about the subject and did as much research as I could, and again wanted to be as respectful and not to exploit the subject matter in any way possible editorially. So I tried to be really true to the moments, and you know, and the story was about Viljar, and so we really tried to focus through the island sequence on Viljar and what was happening to him, and so the audience could follow that story and not just show random violence for the sake of random violence. And I think Paul and I were always on the same page about that you know, we want the audience to understand what happened, but we wanted to make it, you know, it's a film, and we wanted to make it you know, watchable for people. And then when we get to the procedural part, it was again trying to always make it, you know, trying to focus us down to Viljar, you know, versus Breivik, and funnel that down into the final trial and Viljar's testimony, and so to kind of reach an emotional climax there.
Thank you very much, and thank all of you. I'm sure you have more questions, and I hope that you continue to have a conversation about this film. Thanks a lot. Good night. Thank you, everyone.